Welcome to Clued in Mystery. I'm Sarah.
And I'm Brooke, and we both love mystery.
Hi, Brooke.
Hi, Sarah. Today we're going to take a closer look at one of Agatha Christie's recurring Scotland Yard detectives, Inspector Japp.
I'm really looking forward to this.
I am too. So, appearing in Agatha Christie's very first novel, The Mysterious Affair at Styles, Japp holds the distinction of being among the earliest characters to work alongside Poirot. He starts off as an inspector and is later promoted to chief inspector of Scotland Yard. Christie drew inspiration for Japp from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Inspector Lestrade in the Sherlock Holmes stories. In fact, the resemblance is quite uncanny. Both of them are occasionally described as ferret faced and play a similar role, the capable, if unimaginative, police officer who serves as a contrast to the brilliant private detective. Japp appears in 7 Poirot novels and several short stories. While he often plays a minor role, usually calling in Poirot for his unique insight, Japp steps into a more prominent position in a few books: Lord Edgeware Dies, Death in the Clouds, and One to Buckle My Shoe. In many ways, Japp functions like Colonel Hastings, though the dynamic is different. Hastings is Poirot's loyal friend and frequent narrator, while Japp is simply a professional colleague, a man of the law who respects Poirot's brilliance, even if he doesn't always understand it. And this two sometimes clash because of this. Japp is taking things at face value and relying on practical evidence. And of course, Poirot dives deep into nuance, motive, and psychology. Japp disappears from Christie's novels after 1940, but he's not entirely forgotten. Poirot mentions him in Death on the Nile and Evil Under the Sun, and another Christie detective, Superintendent Spence, refers to Japp in Taken at the Flood, which didn't come out until 1948. So this was a little nod to readers who remember Japp's earlier contributions. Dame Agatha doesn't give us much access into Japp's personal life. No first name is ever given for Japp in the novels. In adaptations, he's called James Japp, but this isn't from Christie herself. So today we're giving this often overlooked inspector his due.
Well, thank you for that summary, Brooke. Have you read Lord Edgeware's Death in the Clouds or One Two Buckle My Shoe?
I have read One, Two, Buckle My Shoe, but it's not something that I've read really recently. So I don't have a lot of memory of all the ins and outs of the story.
Yeah, because I'm curious about how you mentioned his portrayal is slightly different in those books than in the other ones, and I'm curious about that because I haven't read them, so I can't do that comparison.
Yeah, I think that he just played a more prominent part rather than being such a side character. And this week I read a couple of short stories that really portrayed him prominently. And I think that it probably is similar. I read The Disappearance of Mr. Davenheim short story, as well as The Affair at the Victory Ball. And in these two, really the conversations about solving the mystery happen one on one with Poirot and Japp.
I like that they have this respectful relationship.
Hmm.
I think they respect each other.
I do too. Yeah. Poirot does do his thing where he will point out how someone else isn't nearly as bright as he is and that they need to use their little gray cells and they could figure it out. But I think overall he does respect Japp and he sees him as very professional and, somebody who he enjoyed working with, it seems.
And do we know how they met? I am trying to remember from The Mysterious Affair at Styles if he is introduced to Jap in that book or whether they already knew each other.
I believe that they refer to knowing each other in previous cases, that they met in Belgium in the early 1900s and investigated a forgery together. So I think that the understanding in that very first novel is that they were familiar with each other already. And there's so much about that that I love that Christie does right off the bat because, you and I love how we have this Christie verse where uh, we like to imagine that these characters are out there all coexisting in the world. So I think that that is a nice touch to think that these characters were existing before she ever wrote about them.
I agree. It's like we're inserted partway into their lives.
Hmm. Exactly. Yeah, it's really clever. And that I mentioned how some of the other characters refer to Japp later in her canon, even though he hasn't been in the stories maybe for years, but it's still
Mhm.
that same way of having that continuity and drawing people back to some of the earlier stories.
Yeah, and clearly she was very deliberate in that, right? Like she wouldn't she did that with intention.
Yeah, definitely. Mhm.
I think it's interesting that he's not the only character who kind of fades away though from her story. So even though she continues to refer to him, like you said, he didn't appear past 1940. And our conversation that we had about Hastings was the same thing, right? He didn't appear, he appears in Curtain, but
Mhm.
between Curtain and I don't remember the the story that he appeared in before that, but there was quite a long time. I think it's interesting that she does that with a couple of characters.
Mhm. Definitely. And with Hastings, we get an explanation. We are told that he gets married and he goes to be a cattle rancher, I believe, in Argentina. So we at least have um, an explanation for him. And I think that speaks to how she thought of these characters, maybe, and or how important they were to the stories. Because with Inspector Japp, he literally just disappears. And that goes along with the fact that she doesn't give him a first name. And we've discussed that with other side characters as well. There are people she just doesn't even acknowledge in that way. And she gets criticism for having maybe kind of archetype characters,
Mhm.
but I think that there is a very, as you say, intentional thing. Like Jap was accomplishing what needed to be accomplished in the story. She didn't need him to be a fully fleshed out character. He still like gave that sense of realism and the represented the procedure and the detective of the story, and then created the ability to have the contrast between the way Poirot would think of a case and the policeman did. And I don't necessarily think that that is a bad thing. He did what needed to happen in the story.
I do think though that, you mentioned how Hastings does get this backstory explanation for why he ceases to appear.
Yeah, it is interesting. You wonder how she categorized different characters in her mind, I guess. Like this one is worthy of a full backstory and first name, and
Mhm.
you learn about their private life, and this one is not. I use the word archetypes, and I thought it was really interesting. The short story, The Affair at the Victory Ball, it's based on the characters of the Italian comedies, such as Harlequin, and I don't know, there's 5 or 6 different masked characters, and each of the suspects, this is again, a ball, and each of the suspects is in costume as one of those character archetypes. And, Christie was really inspired by these masked characters in her creation of Mr. Quinn as well, which we've discussed,
Mhm.
Harley Quinn. Uh, so apparently, that art form, which really deals with caricatures or archetype characters, where, um, the Harley Quinn character acts and does things in a certain way, and the different ones kind of fulfill a role, seems to be something she was really intrigued with and really liked to play with, because here we're seeing it again in a short story that where Japp is the lead sleuth.
That is interesting, and interesting that she plays with that theme in that particular short story.
Mhm. And it was great in that the she does this really well. Like if she's going to put something out there, for instance, in this case, it's costumed characters, then you can bet that the solution of the mystery is going to revolve around that. Like she doesn't waste a theme, and this one is definitely that way.
So I know that Jap appears with Hastings in Styles. Um, what about some of his other characters? Does he appear in anything with Ariadne Oliver?
I didn't find any connections with Japp and Oliver, but Miss Lemon is also in The Affair at the Victory Ball, which is another character that we still need to talk about, Sarah. And I think that would be really interesting. And I think that that is a great point that I would love to see if there are some other crossovers. Superintendent Spence, as I mentioned, discusses Japp. It's kind of like hearkening back. I would be interested to know if there's any crossover with Japp and Superintendent Battle. Superintendent Battle actually came to mind for me several times this week in preparing, because I found him so I really liked him. I felt like he was like this heroic, kind of admirable character. And I wanted more Battle because he felt very like real to me. And then Japp is not quite as memorable, is he?
No, he isn't.
No, you really feel like he's just kind of he's there fulfilling his role, as we talked about. Um, and then the very interesting thing that also comes up with these two is Superintendent Battle, as far as the film or TV adaptations, was written out of a lot of the stories that he actually appears in Christie's work. And I think we learned that Miss Marple took over some of his cases and for the TV shows. Um, and the exact opposite happens with Japp. In the scheme of things, he's a pretty small player for Christie, but because he appeared with David Suchet in many of the Agatha Christie's Poirot TV show, it kind of enhanced or expanded that character. I think if you only had watched Poirot on TV, you might think Japp is very important to the Christie verse, and in fact, he's not so much.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And um obviously it wasn't Agatha Christie's decision to write Battle out of the adaptations, right? Someone else has made that choice. Um, but interesting to give one character prominence that another character doesn't, and
Mhm.
reversing their kind of positions in her catalog.
Yeah, that's a really important point to make, that these were not Agatha Christie's choices. Somewhere along the line, producers or writers, took this upon themselves, but it is interesting to see how it played out. Philip Jackson is that well-known actor who portrayed Inspector Japp with David Suchet as Poirot.
Just thinking a little bit more about that respect that we were talking about, in a lot of modern mystery fiction where you have a sleuth that isn't a member of the police force, the police character often expresses some frustration with having this other person, whether they're a hairdresser or a bookshop owner or, whatever their um, reason for being involved in the crime is, kind of appearing at all these crime scenes. And I don't think Poirot and Japp have that same dynamic, right? Because I think, as you said, Japp brings Poirot into the investigations.
Yeah, that's a neat observation. It's true. If there's any rub at all, it might be Poirot being unimpressed with, his skills of deduction, but I don't feel like Japp is trying to keep this private detective out. He's, as you said, inviting him in like, I need your help. You're going to look at this differently than me. So that is really neat, and I think that is an interesting concept because it's very different from a lot of the other mysteries where the trained professionals are trying to keep the amateurs out.
Yeah, yeah, it's an interesting shift that, we don't see that in Christie's fiction, but we do certainly see that is one of the tropes, right, that you expect in uh, a cozy mystery, although Christie wasn't writing cozies, but, um, mysteries featuring non-police sleuths.
Exactly. And I think that even, we mentioned that Japp was patterned after Inspector Lestrade. Even in those, I think that Sherlock Holmes and Lestrade had a more conflicting relationship. And so Christie chose not to do that. And that's pretty
Hmm.
interesting.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's a good point about the relationship between Lestrade and Sherlock Holmes, because I think it was fraught with more tension.
Hmm. Definitely.
Well, thanks, Brooke. I think this has been really fun to learn a little bit more about this character that, we don't get to see a lot of in Christie's book.
It has been fun. I love learning about some of these less talked about characters, and it just adds more to all the stories. So, thank you, Sarah, and thank you, listeners, for joining us today on Clued in Mystery. But for today, I'm Brooke.
And I'm Sarah, and we both love mystery.
Clued in Mystery is written and produced by Brooke Peterson and Sarah M. Stephen. Music is by Shane Ivers. If you liked what you heard, please consider telling a friend, leaving a review, or subscribing with your favorite podcast listening app. Visit our website at cluedinmystery.com to sign up for our newsletter, The Clued In Chronicle, or to join our paid membership, The Clued In Cartel. We're on social media at Clued In Mystery.